Today's webinar is entitled The Recent UK Elections, What Do the Results Mean for the UK, Brexit, and Transatlantic Business, and is brought to you by the European American Chamber of Commerce, where Europeans and Americans meet to do business. Now, you've seen their bios when you registered for today's event, but let me briefly introduce our panelists in speaking order. First, and speaking to us from London, is Richard Eccles. Richard is a partner with the London-based law firm Bird & Bird with over 30 years experience advising firms on EU and UK competition law, telecommunications regulation, and trade and customs matters. And as you might imagine, since 2016, he spent considerable time advising clients and firms on how to prepare for Brexit. Second, joining us from Paris is Thaima Samman, the founder of the Cabinet Samman law firm. She has a broad history in a number of sectors, starting her career as a founding member of a French NGO combating racism, then working for a senior member of the French Parliament. She's also worked in companies like Philip Morris and Microsoft before starting her own firm. Finally, based in New York, but joining me here in Cincinnati, is Marc Chandler, the Chief Market Strategist at Bannockburn Global Forex. Marc has watched and commented on global capital markets for over 30 years, including time at HSBC and Brown Brother Harriman before joining Bannockburn. He's a prolific writer and speaker. If you haven't got his book, Political Economy of Tomorrow, you may recognize him from his many appearances on CNBC, Bloomberg TV, CNN, and Fox Business. So with that, let's get started. Richard, let's start with you. What's the view from London?
Okay, thank you, Todd. Thanks very much. Well, so I must talk about what the UK elections mean in terms for the UK and for Brexit and for transatlantic relations. Starting with the general election result, it basically, in relation to Brexit at least, was the end of Remain, by which I mean it signified a failure to unite on the part of the so-called Remain parties, including the Labour Party, the main opposition, whose membership is largely pro-EU and pro-Remain, but which have an anti-EU or pro-Brexit leadership, which rather gave them a confused position. And they were heavily beaten, and the very pro-Remain Liberal Democrats, the third party, merely maintained their position. They did not improve it. So there was a big shift from a big swing from Labour to Conservative, and Conservatives ended up with a very large majority of about 80, which gives them considerable strength in the House of Commons, in Parliament, because the upper house, the House of Lords, does not have a great deal of influence in practice. And as a result, we see the Prime Minister Boris Johnson able to flex his muscles. And also, before the election, he had ensured that all candidates representing the Conservative Party had given a personal commitment to support the EU withdrawal bill, which is the national implementing legislation to implement the UK-EU withdrawal agreement. So there would be no opposition from within his own party, and they've all adhered to that. The reason being that there were a lot of rebels in the Conservative Party that caused much of the political difficulties and hiatus in the British Parliament in the run-up to the election. So we now have a clear run for Brexit. I might, before going into that, I might just pause to just mention the position in Scotland and Northern Ireland, as was also on my agenda. The position in Scotland is that the Scottish National Party won 48 seats out of a potential 55 in Scotland, and that was up from I think 35 or thereabouts in the previous election. So they had a very strong showing indeed. And of course, they want independence for Scotland, and for that purpose, they want to have another independence referendum for the Scottish people. But the UK government has to agree to that first. And at the moment, the Prime Minister is opposed. There was, you might remember, a referendum which resulted in a vote to stay in the UK in Scotland in 2014, just a couple of years before the main EU referendum. But if the SNP, Scottish National Party, continues to do well in the Scottish Assembly, then it may well be that politically the demands for another referendum will be difficult to resist. And given that a clear majority in Scotland voted in favour of remaining in the EU in the 2016 referendum, they claim this is a change of circumstances that would justify having another referendum, and also could lead to a vote to secede from the UK this time. Whether it really will is another matter, because there are such strong economic dependency of Scotland on the rest of Britain, and in particular England, that in the end, a majority of the Scottish people may well still, despite everything, decide to remain in the United Kingdom for economic security. But who knows? We live in politically uncertain times. We really don't know. The position within Northern Ireland is very interesting. I mean, the Northern Irish seats in Westminster, in the UK Parliament, it was a very similar number was won by the Unionist Party, the DUP, Democratic Unionist Party, and the two nationalist parties, Sinn Féin and the SDLP, won, I think, between them just only one less seat than the Unionist Party. The significance of this is, well, in the Northern Ireland Assembly, the division between Unionist and National parties is, from memory, also approximately evenly split. And the question here is, given that Northern Ireland, under the Northern Ireland Protocol, under the UK-EU Withdrawal Agreement, is effectively treated for economic purposes, or at least for trade purposes, as if it was with Ireland in the EU, because for trade and customs purposes, there's going to have to be a border in the Irish Sea. It's possible that over time, the people of Northern Ireland may see the sense in being economically properly united with Ireland. This is all speculative at this stage, but it is reported, and there are polls showing that there's increasing support or sympathy even in Northern Ireland for a united Ireland, and likewise in Southern Ireland. It's not going to happen in the near future, but as we say, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 10-year time span or so. I could speculate further on that, but I'll leave it for any discussions at the end as to how people in England would feel about that, or how people in Northern Ireland would feel about it, and so on. But moving on, the path is now clear, as I say, for the UK-EU Withdrawal Agreement to be implemented, which means that we don't have a hard Brexit on 31st of January. Rather, the critical date in legal terms is now the 31st of December. The withdrawal bill, which authorises ratification by the UK, is now before the Queen for royal assent, so it'll become an act, formal law, in the next few days, and then the European Parliament will give its approval at a plenary session arranged for the 29th of January. So really the critical date from my point of view as a lawyer is not the 31st of January, but the 31st of December, because that's when the transition period under the withdrawal agreement ends. Because during the transition period, EU law continues to apply in and in relation to the UK in the same way as if the UK were a member state, and EU law has to be interpreted in the same way and given the same force as it does within the EU member states. So from a legal point of view and from a trade and customs point of view, because this includes the EU Customs Code, nothing much changes immediately. The big question is what is really going to happen with Northern Ireland, and what is going to happen in the trade negotiations that are going to take place between the UK and the EU during the transitional period. And whether we get a trade agreement or any sort of relationship agreement. In practice, it'll be just a free trade agreement, if anything, by the end of 2020 for the subsequent period. Or will we actually end up with a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of December? This remains to be seen, and it's difficult to predict. I think what I would just say is, as regards the Northern Ireland Protocol, there is a lot of uncertainty. This is the big difficult issue about whether we could find a way to enabling the UK to leave the EU without jeopardising the politically important soft border, the land border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which is both a UK frontier and a single market frontier. Well, this is in the end being done as a result of the Prime Minister Boris Johnson's hasty negotiations with the EU last autumn to give a new Northern Ireland protocol. There's going to be the border in the Irish Sea, whereby customs duties have to be charged on intra-UK trade between Britain and Ireland, and inspections of goods for standards, conformity and so on can be required by the EU at the same phase on that border between Britain and Northern Ireland in the Irish Sea. And VAT has to be charged, also EU VAT on goods going into Northern Ireland. Unless you can show that there's no risk of this is for customs duties at least, unless there's no risk of the goods going forward into Ireland or the EU. But the key point is that all those working arrangements, the implementation of these, what will inevitably be complex arrangements, have got to be worked out by a UK-EU joint committee. So the principle looks good, but the how on earth it's going to be made to work in practice remains to be seen. When we come to the political declaration between the UK and the EU, which accompanies the withdrawal agreement, it's non-binding, but the difference between what it contains and what's likely to happen in practice is quite striking. The political declaration calls for tariff-free trade, which perhaps is achievable, but also calls for deeper liberalisation in services and data-related activities. Whether that will actually happen remains to be seen. The EU is likely to say that if the UK wants to integrate more closely and have closer liberalisation for financial services and other services industries, which of course account for the vast majority of the UK economy, or at least for exports, then the UK is going to have to align on competition, state aid, social protection, environmental protection and tax. And the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer has said, we, the UK, don't want to do that. We don't want to align. We want non-alignment. We don't want to be a rule taker. So there's a standoff. There's going to be a trade-off for the UK between liberalisation and alignment. Fisheries could become important, although it's a small part of the UK economy. It's politically very significant because the EU wants access to UK fishing waters. The UK wants to keep them to itself. And in Scotland, which, as I've already mentioned, the political sensitivities there about independence, very important issue in Scotland also. So that remains to be seen. But given this standoff, it's far from certain that there'll be any free trade agreement at the end of this year. Even just a tariff-free trade agreement. Nothing can be counted upon. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens. I would also add that the UK has rolled over about half of the EU free trade agreements with third countries to become UK agreements on similar terms with those countries. And it's reported that there are already negotiations about between the UK and the US for a trade agreement. How serious those negotiations are, I can only speculate, because legally those negotiations can't take place until after the UK has left the EU customs union at the end of the year. So we'll see how the year unfolds. I've probably gone on a bit too much. I do apologise, and I'll stop there.
No worries, Richard. That's fascinating. I mean, I think it's just a great reminder that Brexit is far from done. It's we're sort of at the end of the beginning. Although I don't think I want to say something as dire as the beginning of the end. No, that's a great quick overview. Obviously, I mean, we could do an hour, 2 hours just on this specific topic, but I do want to move on and hear from Thaima. So, you have offices in Brussels and Paris. So where is the EU? What's the EU current take on a lot of these issues?
Well, firstly, we have to say that the EU is working and is working hard, in particular because this is the first time that a country is exiting the EU jurisdictions. We have been, until the creation of the European Union, on a positive dynamic of country joining. And actually, we have a few of Europe from a continental definition knocking at the door to enter into the EU. This is the first time, so there is no jurisprudence. The economy and the regulation and the rules are very integrated. So the EU is pretty well aware that they want a deal. They didn't want the UK to exit first because it's in contradiction with the current dynamic and what they wanted to achieve. They accepted the UK to go, and they were actually relieved that now the things are clearer, because for 2 years it has been a bit erratic and nothing could move, and the EU agenda was only about Brexit. So it's a good news that at the end the UK Parliament adopted the Withdrawal Agreement, which will allow now the process to start on the exit procedure with no doubt and no margin of maneuver not to do it. I think I sent to you a slide to remind everybody the timeline. I don't know if people are seeing it. Yes, perfect. So although I agree with Richard that we don't know where this is going, what we know is that we know a certain number of rules that I would like to remind. So now what's going to happen? Next week, the European Parliament should ratify the Withdrawal Agreement. We don't expect any surprise there. We don't expect surprise in particular, as the European Parliament has already put in place a task force to prepare the adoption of the Withdrawal Agreement prepared by the European Commission. So that should take place. And on January 31st, the transposition period of 1 year should start. Maybe important to remember, to remind people that the 1 year of discussion transition period has been chosen by the UK, who wanted to be quick. The EU would have been ready to give more time, in particular as trade agreements usually take a long time, 3 to 10 years for some of them. So 1 year seems pretty short, but they accepted it and they are preparing for it. Because it's not a country, on February 1st, the European Commission will publish its negotiating mandate that are given to it by the 27 remaining member states. And this negotiating agreement should be approved by the EU Council, i.e. the EU 27, by the end of February. So as for then, only the European Commission will have a mandate to negotiate with the UK, who will have only one interlocutor, who are the working group led by Michel Barnier, to negotiate with the UK what is going to look like. Then the deadline set on the withdrawal agreement is that on June 2020, if they are willing to, the UK can ask for an extension period if they think they are not going to be ready. As Boris Johnson has been very clear that he doesn't want to, we don't know. They have up to November to decide to extend this exit period. December 31st, if there is no request for transition period, the Brexit will be over. Either we will have a deal or the UK will join the third country status and being bound by the WTO rules. So once it's done, so where I totally agree with Richard is that the EU is totally aware that we are in a cutting edge and that the discussion can be either very productive with trade and a political deal that is satisfactory for everybody, or we enter in another stage with a risk in each period that everything can go south. So now, what will be the consequences of this beginning of the transition period? First, as of February 1st, the UK won't participate to any of the EU decision anymore for the next year to come. but it will remain part of the single market and of the custom union. But, and I think, Richard, that my view, our understanding is that they will be able to start preparing trade deals with other countries, which they were not allowed to do until now. They are not in the EU anymore. They will be able to start preparing the other trade deal with other countries. So EU and UK will start to design the architecture of the future deal with, from the EU point of view, an approach which is the following. They are going to, as they want things to be as smooth as possible at the end of the transition period, they will try to set general agreements on principle and on goods. So address the most difficult issues and focus on the most difficult issues and in the principles. And if they can, to start some specific agreements on specific sectors, and I will come to that, that may not be ready on December 2020, but ready to roll, so as we know where we stand in terms of relationship with the UK. In the general deal, what they are going to look for is a governance system that should identify a common dispute settlement mechanism, and they will require the UK to take a position and to adopt the rules on their position regarding the compliance of the UK with the European law, which will be instrumental in designing the rest of the deal. So what they will expect from the mandate: a tariff zero quota trade agreement for goods. They think they can achieve that, even it's more difficult for services, but with some specific rules on specific sectors such as health, a level playing field in the economic relations, identifying some specific issues that will need to be addressed, and I picked a few of them regarding what I know of the people that are listening to us of interest. For example, of course, the financial sector, which is very important for the UK, but also for the US and for the rest of the EU. During the transition period, the EU rules will continue to apply, so no change. But at the end of the transition period, if we don't have a specific deal, the UK should lose their passport rights. And if they are willing to, so either we are able to have the beginning of a deal on financial services to address this situation, or they will have to start a process of equivalence system and body that are already granted to other countries to have the right to operate as such on the European market in a smooth way. Clearly, this issue is a priority for the EU, and we understand that it's also a priority for the city. But it will be, per definition, a specific and very important discussion, together with the fisheries that Richard mentioned as well. And maybe worth to mention that the trade commissioner, with Irish commissioner, Irish guy, mentioned that fishery can be traded against financial services. So that the EU has identified that are two main issues for the UK, and one can be traded over another one. For Phil Hogan, it would be fishery, the priority, giving some advantage to the financial services, but that's Phil Hogan's position. It remains to be seen where it is going. Another issue which is also key is, of course, the transfer of data. The UK is today a kind of platform for third countries to be able to transfer data in one sense or another to other geography, in particular to the US. If the UK loses status, is going to be an issue in particular for the US. So again, the EU is open to discuss with the UK an equivalence agreement, which is today in the current European legislation framework. So we continue to be smooth. It's just going to be a question of bureaucratic discussion and the capacity to the UK to demonstrate that they will continue to respect and to comply with the EU rules regarding first privacy, data confidentiality, and other key elements on the free flow of data. Another element which is key but which is not an economic issue is the security partnership. As you probably know, there is no such thing as the European defence without France and the UK. So it remains to be seen what the UK wish to do in this area and how security can be discussed. My guess is that the UK is pretty open to this discussion because it's everybody's interest, in particular in the crazy world that we are living it at the moment. And there is a few security cooperation programs that are at stake, which are different, more intergovernmental than EU integrated situation. You asked me in our preparatory discussion if there is a risk of other EU exit. So we looked at it, and we doubt that, because the EU has been, since its creation, has been producing a lot of wealth and economic success for the European Union, in particular for the countries that are challenging it the most. And I'm thinking in particular of the east part of Europe, but they are the ones today benefiting from a financial and economic viewpoint the most from the EU organization. So the more they take it as a positioning and a political posture, but there is no sign that they will go further than that. Another country will be Italy, the same, a lot of noise, but no real proposition to exit. Now, with the Brexit, everything can happen, and any politician can drive its country to a place where the exit will become
well, let me stop you there. Let me stop you there, Thaima, because I mean, I think that the question of whether pressures for other countries to leave the EU or to stay in, or accession efforts and so forth, I mean, I think that's also a very important issue. But I also want to make sure that we have enough time for Marc to make his points, so I kind of review from the US side, as well as to make sure we have some time at the end for the discussion. So
can I just add one thing in conclusion, is that either we have a deal or the UK become a third country like the US or any country in the world. That's a risk. And the objective is more to have a Canada freestyle trade agreement by the end of the year and time to negotiate other things. And also a lot of politics there, as the agreement needs to be approved by the European Parliament. So 27 MPs with the political rhetoric and dynamic that will intervene in what could be the deal tomorrow.
Again, back to the point, you know, that we are at the beginning of the end, and now the real work begins. So it's very interesting to see how this, or the end of the beginning, as I said earlier. So there's still a lot of work to be done. Just before I turn it over to Marc, a quick reminder for our attendees: if you do have questions, please go ahead and use that Q&A button now to type them in, and we'll be sure to go through those when we conclude. But now I'm going to turn to Marc and ask him for his thoughts from the U.S. view, and maybe just kind of a little bit global context.
Sure, thank you. Good morning. I think that there are two big issues for Americans when thinking about Brexit and what this means. The first is what it means for the U.S. and the UK, U.S.-European relationships, but also it's part of some global forces that are taking place. And I think that after the sort of out of the ashes of the great financial crisis and the end of that sort of phase of development, that the economic nationalism is coming to succeed or supersede where we had sort of the Reagan Thatcher driven liberalism, and by liberalism I mean just the reduction of regulation, especially for the movement of capital and for the movement of goods and services across borders. And so in some ways, I think, after the UK voted with the referendum, as you mentioned, in June 2016, it was 5 months later that the US voted for Trump President of the United States. And I think that both of them, everybody's trying to link the two together and somehow, and perhaps the link is out of nationalism and the importance of there, by seeing the nationalistic tendencies, it really tells us what we should expect, I think, from a US-UK trade agreement down the road. But just to go back a little bit and talk about what's going on globally, I think that the post-World War II, the movement was towards what I'd call variable shares. Now, what the US did, in effect, Pax Americana, if you will, was setting up rules of engagement, how countries should compete with each other. It was economic competition and the rules of the game. But the rules of the game, by focusing on the rules, that helps those that can succeed by those rules. And the US was confident post-World War II that the free trade rules, they were embodied in GATT, they were embodied in the IMF, they were embodied in the World Bank, that these rules, broad framework, would allow the US to succeed, would allow other countries to develop. But something's taken place around the great financial crisis. And I think that is that the Americans no longer feel that the global system, rule-based system, is working in their interest. Partly because countries, we see with China, say, gaming the rules. A lot of the trade rules were set up for countries that have large state-sponsored sectors. And this changes the competition, and the US pulling back from this commitment to the multilateralism, if you will. At the same time, the UK was not an original member of the EU, and it joined reluctantly, partly because of how its economy underperformed. And ironically, France at the time was the biggest nemesis. France did not want the UK to join, and so now that now 30 years later, the UK is thinking, well, maybe we shouldn't be in the club in the first place. And they would argue, I think, correct me though, Richard, if I'm wrong here, is my sense is, talking to my friends and my contacts in the UK, that they think the EU has changed, that the UK hasn't changed, but the EU's changed. And for me, it's partly a function of the success of the UK strategy, which was a broadening of the European Union rather than a deepening of it. And as you have more countries join, you have to give up the unanimity of voting. That's how the US voted after the Articles of Confederation. We had one state, one vote, and it required, in effect, that everybody agreed. And it's possible, perhaps, when there's a small number of people, but as the UK helped the EU expand, more countries joining, the UK had to give up its veto. And it began losing some votes, and even the qualified majority voting seemed not to have been enough. And so I think the UK exiting from the EU is similar to the US, parallels with the US, not as committed, say, to the WTO as it had been, not as committed to the rule-based system, more concerned now, and we see this with the US trade agreement with China, more focused on the outcome rather than the rules themselves. For the US, I think for US companies, the UK leaving the EU is a very important challenge. And here's why. Many US companies have to penetrate into Europe, have used the UK as a point of production and distribution into the rest of the EU. And they've been able to do so duty-free. And when it projects ahead, what's going to happen, I think that along the lines Richard said, is even that there's going to be now a border, in effect, a customs check between the UK and Northern Ireland. And I think that what we have to anticipate, US businesses, and whether or not there could be a free trade agreement along the way that the EU and Canada reach an agreement, which I think reduced tariffs on something like 98% of the goods. That if the UK hopes to get an agreement like that, there have to be a lot more concessions, and I think that businesses can't really count on that. That over time, I think that's not just Johnson, Prime Minister Johnson, it's not just the Chancellor of the Exchequer, it's also the Bank of England, Governor Carney, who said that the UK does not want to be a rule taker. It wants to use its own. It's much better for the UK in this situation to have its own rules and regulations, and this is going to create some drift between the rules of the UK, the rules of the EU, and eventually the US companies who are located in the UK to service the continent are going to be at a disadvantage. So a number of different businesses, especially I think along the lines where it suggests already the financial services, we're seeing a lot of the financial services companies think about where they want to go. When we think about financial services, it's not just the banks, but it's the lawyers that support them. It is the accountants. It's really an ecosystem that supports the service sector. And the UK, of course, has its advantages. And so as US companies look to relocate to a country deeper in the EU, Ireland becomes an obvious choice, Dublin especially for the financial center, for these ancillary services as well. Paris has often wanted to become the financial center seen on the continent, and some business does seem to be going there as well. We also see prices in Frankfurt real estate market rising, as if it looks like some levels of businesses will also move to Frankfurt. But this is the challenge for US businesses, where up until now they've been able to export from the UK to the EU duty-free or vice versa, import from the EU to the UK. And I think we should anticipate, even though it's not clear yet, but we should anticipate as businesses that there's going to be more friction between the UK and the EU trade, and friction, of course, economic friction means higher costs. But besides the UK and the EU negotiating a free trade agreement for the standstill period, as you suggested, the next 11 months, the UK will begin negotiations with the US on a trade agreement. And the Lighthizer, the trade representative for the US, suggests that a deal could be reached by the summer. Trump has suggested that it could increase trade 3- or 4-fold between the US and the UK. They're very optimistic ideas, and I think that we see just a hint of realism with what's going on with this digital tax. Let me just sum it up quickly for you, and I think you'll be able to see a lot of the ways that what it says really about the future of US and UK trade. Last year, the French decided that there were companies, the large digital companies, were making profits off of French people, off of French consumers, but were not being taxed for it. And so they imposed a tax, and of course the US retaliated, threatening to put 100% tariff on about $2.4 billion worth of French goods. A deal was just reached in the past, say, week or so, where it looks like the French will not collect that levy until the end of the year, giving time for the multilateral organizations, whether it's the EU or the OECD, to work this out. However, the problem is that there's another country in the EU proposing their own digital tax, Italy, but the UK has proposed its own digital tax as well. Johnson campaigned on the idea of a digital tax, and the fiscal budget, the next year's fiscal budget, it already includes revenue from this digital tax. Even after the US threatened tariffs in retaliation if the UK goes forward, the Johnson government has already indicated they plan on going forward with this tax, this digital tax, which seemed, of course, from an American point of view, hits US corporates, the US tech giants, harder than other companies. And so the US, so what this points to, I think, is a couple of things. One is the inability of the international system, whether it's the OECD because of the US actually not wanting the rules to be binding, or the EU, where countries like Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and Ireland blocked a multilateral agreement. So the failure of the international has really helped foster a nationalist solution. And secondly, I think it shows that the US and the UK have a special relationship, but when it comes to nationalism, economic nationalism, sort of no holds, there's no friends, there's only interests, I'd say, that's, I think, to paraphrase George Washington. And so I think that we're stuck then. Here we are, 3.5 years after the UK votes for the referendum to leave the EU. They're going to leave the EU and enter the standstill period, but it's still not clear for US businesses. And that uncertainty is what we're motivated by. Because it's not clear, we have to act. We could hope for the best, but we need to prepare for, say, a less best case scenario. Thank you.
Well, Mark, I think that's extraordinarily interesting, and I appreciate you putting the onus. I mean, in some ways, you can point to Brexit as a symptom rather than a challenge in itself. I mean, the problem is in some ways that our international trading system, the liberal order, as some might call it, is sclerotic. The IMF needs to be updated. The World Trade Organization needs to be updated, and so forth. But of course, that's a much broader discussion than I think we're prepared to have here today. Before we go to questions and answers, and again, I'll remind people, we have a couple of questions that have come in. If you have questions for our panelists, please go ahead and submit them. But before we go to the questions and answers from our attendees, let me just ask, among the three speakers today, I mean, do any of you want to react to what the other may have said? I mean, Richard is Thaima way out of line, just like the rest of those Europeans. Thaima, do you want to take a skillet and hit Richard over the head and say, you guys just need to get this right? I'm just going to offer that real quick to see. I don't see anybody raising their hand, but I did see Richard turn off his mute button. So maybe Richard, you want to start?
Well, I'm just turning off the mute button, ready for the discussion. But no,
okay.
there's nothing that Thaima said that I fundamentally disagree with, nor that Marc said. I think the UK and the US will agree a trade deal, and that in itself is, I have to say, very exciting. Yes, there's bound to be some disagreement about this digital tax, which is a relatively recent proposal, but it is a long-standing issue because in the digital world, companies, they don't act physically, and so it's easier for them to use arrangements to notionally locate their profits in a tax-convenient location. And it's not, the proposals are not discriminatory against the US. It just so happens that all the big tech companies are from the US. But the same rules would apply to tech companies of any nationality. And the US and the UK are also have different, or their leaderships at least have different views on Iran as well. So these are two countries with which make their own minds upon things, but are broadly and for the most part and in the long term pursuing similar goals. And so I'm sure it'll be within their capabilities sooner or later to strike a trade agreement. And there are a couple of interesting questions raised in the Q&A from the audience, which I could happily comment on. But Todd, I'll let you. You're the chair, so you.
Just one thing too, just again to point out, it's interesting that fishery is probably one of the oldest industries. That there's important disputes to be settled there. And then this digital services tax and so forth, of course, this entirely new industry. Again, it's just hard for tax authorities and trade ministers to kind of keep up with this stuff. But yeah, well, let's go ahead and look at some of the questions. And the first one I think is really interesting, and maybe I'll put it to Thaima first, is do you get a sense that the European Union is looking at the reasons the people of the UK voted for Brexit and are considering policy changes to ensure something similar doesn't happen in another country? We touched briefly on this, but I mean, living in Europe, I mean, how do you think is the EU trying to address the, in many cases, legitimate complaints that the UK citizens have?
So maybe let me answer in two parts in this one, and to elaborate on what Marc has just said. UK is probably the country that joined the EU in the most. They didn't want to. They went there, I think, under the US pressure because they wanted to have a strong ally there to make sure that Europe was behaving well first, but they never felt like the rest of Europe as part of a common adventure, that they've always been apart, even if they have been very smart and very in influencing it. That was not that was an arranged marriage, not a love marriage from the UK from the start. And the second answer I would like to give is that the question is very legitimate, but the issue is that there is a misunderstanding of what the EU is. And probably because the EU is not a country, there is no patriotic feeling. It's a jurisdiction, it's an administration, it's a bureaucracy, and that's probably what the EU failed to put in place. It's this feeling of belonging and solidarity that we are all in, and we are not anymore French or German or Lithuanian or whatever, but European. And there is today no such thing as a European, because it has been in a, when I'm qualifying the EU, I usually say it's a thing. Don't try to find something similar in the world. It's something new that never happened, where some country voluntarily accepted to give up some sovereignty, to give it to a bureaucracy to make decisions because they thought on paper that it will be better for everybody. And if you look at rational figure, it did, but it doesn't exist emotionally. So it's not a question of policy. And you can imagine it's the same for a country, but it's worse for the country, for the EU. You're never going to make decisions that will please to everybody. That doesn't exist. The EU is a place where you compromise in between different national and category interests to try to find a solution. You will never love it. So if we want to, we can build something else, but as it is today, it's a place to negotiate and find a compromise. And you don't love your bankers or your lawyer. You just know that you need them. It's the same with the EU.
That's a great answer, and it's very interesting. You know, it's sort of just to plug the European American Chamber of Commerce. Of course, it's kind of one of the things that led to our creation. One of our sort of founder emeritus, Marcel Marchand-Tonnel, said, you know, there are no French companies or German companies anymore. We're European companies, and so that's why we wanted to create the European American Chamber of Commerce. So. Go
from a legal viewpoint, you're right. From a legal viewpoint, but but the emotional part doesn't exist.
That's right. The other question that came up, and I think you addressed this a little bit, Thaima, but Richard, I'll ask you maybe to comment on this as well, is so how will the UK and the EU work together through this transition period in terms of decision making within the EU? That is, with regard to ongoing trade negotiations between the EU and the US, you know, other EU internal decision-making process. What's going to be the role of the UK in that? I mean, I can't remember. Are the UK representatives still sitting in the Parliament?
Well, I don't think the UK is going to have much of a role, to be quite honest. I mean, even during the transition period, the UK will no longer be represented in the EU bodies and institutions because it will no longer be a member state, even though EU law will continue to apply during the transitional period to the UK. I think the EU will decide its own position in any discussions with the US during the coming 11 months. It's not going to take into account the UK's position because the EU is a bloc and it takes a position as a single bloc. The UK, for its part, will want to take its own position, and the UK and the EU will have enough to talk about with their own future relationship agreement without at the same time trying to reach a harmonized position in relation to the US. So I think there's very little chance of any meaningful cooperation between the UK and the EU in that area. Not because the UK and the EU will not be friendly to each other. I think they will. I think the dynamics won't lead to cooperation in that way. So that's my view on that point. I don't know whether you'd like me to comment from a UK perspective on the first question, which was a very interesting one that Thaima has already commented on, Todd, or do we not have time?
Well, I think Marc wanted to touch this issue as well.
I'm thinking that because the UK is leaving the EU, the way the EU negotiates with the US won't involve the UK. And I can appreciate that is a fair view. I could understand from the UK why that would be their perspective. I think the American attitude, the American administration's attitude is a bit different. And I think the test case for that is the illegal, or what the WTO said were improper subsidies to Airbus. The US threatened to sanction, put tariffs on UK goods, even though, as you say, the UK is not going to be in the EU. And so there seems to be like Airbus would be one of those issues that, and we're going to see it come up again when Boeing works its way through the process as well. But it's one of those issues that the UK it's not going to be as clean of a cut for the UK. There still are lingering interests that the UK has in the EU, and Airbus is a great case of where the US seems to me to treat the UK like it's part of the EU, regardless of what happens in this transition period or even next year.
That's a good point. Richard, did you want to go back to Thaima's comment? I think we have one more question.
Okay, very briefly. I mean, because the question asked why the UK people voted the way it did, and is the EU going to take this into account going forward? I would say two things. First of all, and I do agree with what Thaima said about the character of the EU, but I think the UK people voted to leave the EU for all sorts of superficial reasons, and in many cases without fully understanding what they're doing. I'm sorry to say that, but that is the truth, believe me. In terms of why a referendum was called and why Prime Minister David Cameron felt that there was a need for a referendum, that's a different question. And those questions, which won't have been understood by the vast majority of the electorate, or at least most of the electorate, if not the vast majority of them, were questions like, we are exposed in the UK, even as a non-Euro member, by the measures that the Euro countries want to take collectively to support the Euro countries that are in real economic difficulties as a result of the Euro financial obligations, and the inability or unwillingness through the Euro stability mechanism that was introduced to give enough safeguards to the non-Euro single market members. And there was the issue of immigration, the fact that the EU, when it was created, was a roughly equal partnership of 6 countries, gradually enlarged, countries with roughly equal economies and living standards, where you'd have a free flow of people between those countries. But in the modern world, with the widening and Eastern European countries come in, we have one-way traffic of people from Eastern Europe to the UK mainly, and it's completely imbalanced. Now, most of those people coming from Eastern Europe to the UK are getting jobs, and the economy needs them, so it's a good thing. But nonetheless, this is how large members of the population see it. And there was suggestions for reform, but the EU was not willing to reform. It is more concerned about maintaining the solidarity of the single market. And in relation to immigration from outside the EU, from North Africa, for example, that's an area where the EU failed to produce a response. And these things had an impact in the UK. Whether any of them are being changed now going forward from within the EU, I rather doubt. The EU is a phenomenally strong economic union. There's nothing like the single market in the world. And I'm personally very sorry that the UK won't be a part of it anymore after this year. But the EU is also not necessarily the most flexible, because it's got this fantastic creation, and then it has to put a lot of effort into maintaining the unity behind the single market.
Well, Richard, your comments lead me to one other question, and just we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to be, we will finish at the top of the hour. That's my promise to you. But your comment, and also I want to ask Thaima, but another question has come in. My sense is that younger European citizens are seeing themselves as more European than Lithuanian, Belgian, so forth and so on. Thaima, I'd be interested in your response. But Richard, I mean, as you point out, lots of Europeans have emigrated to the UK, to live, to work, and so forth. I mean, do you get a sense that they are ready to go back to Europe? Will there be a flight of those folks from the UK? And then Thaima, your sense on just sort of, is that European feeling more permeating? Richard first.
No, I think the younger people, including younger British people, are pro-European, and the younger members of the population, not all of them got out and voted, unfortunately, in 2016. But if there had been a second referendum, I would have expected the younger members of the population to have come out in force. And of course, there would be, in a sense, more younger people because of demographic development. I'd say there's been a slowdown of immigration from Eastern Europe to the UK. But I don't think one can say anymore that that's simply because of the lack of certainty of the position, or perceived lack of certainty of the position of the Eastern Europeans. I think it's difficult to generalise beyond that. I think once the EU settlement scheme for EU citizens in the UK is settled down, I think I would hope we'll continue to see EU citizens getting jobs and living in the UK.
Thaima, about 3 minutes left. Did you want to comment on that? Maybe Marc had something a thought on it as well.
Yeah, and I don't think the young Europeans feel more European than the older one. I think it's the other way around because of the souvenir of the war. I think more generally speaking, we are seeing the world globalization going back to closing their door. And I just want to conclude, if you give me 30 seconds, I think it's a pity for the UK that they are leaving, because they had it all in the European Union. They were paying less. They were very influential on the rules that allow them to export a lot. And the EU has been designed according to what they wanted, a European market, economic market, and less political integration. They are leaving it. They are not going to influence it anymore. And they will not have access to the European market they have contributed to build in the worst case scenario, unless they accept a deal when they are not going to pay less to be able to have access to this market. So for political and irrational reasons, it's really a lose-lose situation for them. And unfortunately, I tend to think that it's not a win situation for the EU.
Yeah, as we say in the United States, elections have consequences. Marc, I'm going to give you the final word.
I was just thinking about the sort of youth vote and what that means, and I think that we see the same kind of thing in the United States, in the sense that the large debt that these countries have accumulated in Europe as well as the US, this is really a generational transfer. And I think we saw when Scotland last had their referendum on their own independence, they allowed 16-year-olds the right to vote. In the US, we have some primaries, some state primaries that people younger than 18 can vote. But you know, out of this financial crisis, we really didn't get the franchise to be extended, unlike other crises. When young people, 18-year-olds, got the right to vote, or women got the right to vote. But I think that that's what's going to happen, is that increasingly we're going to get, whether it's the green movement, whether it's the debt issues, the generational transfer, I think that the franchise, I think that's the part of the progressive movement, to extend the franchise to people, young people, 16-year-olds, who have access to information, as we know, and have a vested interest in these long-term issues, whether the UK is part of the EU, what we do about the environment. So I think that it's just a tip of the iceberg, but I do think that there's a generational conflict that's like boiling below the surface.
Yeah. As I said earlier, I mean, I think that this is the Brexit is a symptom of a lot of much deeper issues that go to tax policy, trade policy, the international liberal order that we built after World War II, so forth and so on. Obviously, we're not going to address all of those today, but I think at least we got a good sense of this small piece of it, which of course is enormous for our friends in the UK and Europe, and of course on this side of the Atlantic as well. So this concludes our webinar today, the recent UK elections, what do the results mean for the UK, Brexit, and transatlantic business, brought to you by the European American Chamber of Commerce, where Europeans and Americans meet to do business. I want to thank Richard Eccles, Thaima Samman, and Marc Chandler for joining us today, for sharing your insights, your experience, and thanks everybody online who has participated in this discussion. Please stay in touch with your local chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce for information on upcoming webinars and events. And also be sure to look for a recording of this webinar, which will be posted on our YouTube channel in a few days. Farewell.